this is an outline. First, I need to give you a crash course on Chinese history and politics, 10 minutes or so to cover that, so that you can appreciate how game making in China that uses the past as a resource is unthinkable without considering the influence of the Communist Party. I'll be using the term state when I actually mean Communist Party. I might be saying party state or one party state, but it is really the same thing in many contexts. The Communist Party, the Chinese state, same thing roughly, depending of course on specific context. So I will give you that crash course first, and then I will be talking about the game Honor of Kings, which I wrote an article about back in 2020 together with my good colleague and frequent collaborator Paul Martin, understanding Honor of Kings through a state corporation people analytical scheme. In that article, we are talking about something that essentially happened in 2017, which is in a way a long time ago, because China is a place that changes very, very fast. So I thought there was a good opportunity, and by the way, thank you so much for the invitation. I thought this was a good opportunity to reflect on what has been happening in China the past 7 years. And that leads me into my third final part here. Well, I'm talking about understanding a film called The Yin Yang Master. The Yin Yang Master is an adaptation of the game Onmyoji, because all I think about these days is cinematic video game adaptation. That's kind of my thing now. So thanks for mentioning Fallout. I'm also very excited about that series. Okay, so very fast. There are perhaps 5,000 years of history in China, and without essentializing the Chinese, I think it's fair to say that a vast majority of Chinese people are fiercely proud of belonging to this 5,000-year history of belonging to something that we can call China. However, the People's Republic is brand new in that perspective. It's from 1949. And since the establishment of the People's Republic, it has been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. How do you legitimize one-party rule? Of course, from the beginning, that was a question of ideology, being the Communist Party. But over time, that legitimization has shifted towards material progress. You legitimize your rule by saying we are providing the people with material progress. Deng Xiaoping and his opening up a reform period begins. And then little by little, history becomes more and more the key way of legitimizing Communist Party ruled, especially with Xi Jinping, who is now the fifth leader of the People's Republic of China since 2012, which happens to be the year I moved to China. Game making has an interesting link to the past. In the 1990s, we saw a so-called heritage boom in China, domestic tourism. Right now, I'm involved in supervising PhD projects on historical theme parks. So it's still something that's going on in China, how the past is being commercialized and how heritage is being sold. But just to continue this very broad stroke introduction to game making in China, we can think about game making in China as part of the so-called creative industries. In short, the creative industries as a policy is developed in the UK in the late 90s. It is a way of prioritizing a sector that offers enhanced productivity, innovation, and employment. That's essentially how creative industries policy is developed in the UK. When it then is imported into China, China is essentially taking the basic package and then adding two more things. So the Chinese are still saying that, okay, we need to help the creative industries in China because of productivity, innovation, and employment. But the way the political vocabulary in China is developed through lengthy and thorough consultations and conferences with involving various stakeholders, the idea of the creative industries is being changed into something that fits the Chinese context. And the outcome is that we take the standard package and then we add cultural security and soft power. So that is still going on. But let me just say two more words about game making in China as part of the creative industries that ought to include these two key words, soft power and cultural security. It comes out of a sense of insecurity, really, in the 1990s. China has opened up. This starts in the late 70s, and China is, over the years, aiming for ascension, as they put it, to the World Trade Organization in 2001, which was a very important event in world history. It was really something that meant a lot to globalization, that China is becoming part of global production and consumption. But what happens when you open up your country? Won't we have our traditional Chinese culture being overtaken by imports from the West, basically? In the 1990s, this means American film. The concern is still alive in China. Now, American film is being replaced with Korean pop music. I'll get back to that. It has an interesting gender agenda as well. So the idea of cultural security is kind of a buzzword that appears in the public discourse in appreciation or preparing for a WTO membership. And the party itself has been acknowledging this sort of cultural trade deficit. So how do you fix this problem? And the solution is basically soft power and cultural security. So you're sort of saying the creative industries, including game making, they need to, this is part of your remit. You need to help us build soft power, and you need to beef up our cultural security. That thinking is still absolutely present in China. I have a quote from President Xi in October 2020. He was saying that we will deepen exchanges and mutual learning with other civilizations and better present Chinese culture to the world. So that's basically part of the soft power ambition. And as for cultural security, Xi Jinping goes on, to build a modern socialist country in all respects, we must develop a socialist culture with Chinese characteristics and be more confident in our culture. And these grand speeches are quite important because they are interpreted throughout the party system and then implemented at various municipal and provincial levels. So I'm not saying that if you are working for a games company in China, these things are sort of, you don't need to be explicitly aware of these things, but they are there. And these soft power and cultural security parts of Chinese creative industries remit will help you appreciate the case study I will present in a moment. Moving a little into what has been happening since 2012, the party is increasingly in control of the future, the present, and the past. All political parties, I guess they're in the business of shaping the future of their countries. So that's not uncontroversial. It's perhaps a little controversial that the party wants to be present in all aspects of the Chinese life. But the final part is perhaps the most relevant to what we are talking about here when we are talking about folklore, and when I'm sort of translating that into the past as a resource for game making in China. Because all that discussion you just had in the Q&A just before, you don't need to worry about the past. The past is in safe hands. The party will tell you what the past is. And is actually done in very explicit terms. Xi Jinping was saying, and this is a quote from 2013 actually, Xi was saying that historians need to uphold the synthesis of Dongxing. I don't speak Chinese, my pronunciation might be off, but Dongxing is essentially the nature of the party. So historians need to uphold a synthesis of the nature of the party and the scientific nature of historiography. So if you're a historian in China, you need to have an eye to the approved or authorized version of the past that comes out of the party. Another way of illustrating the party's insistence on a monopoly of the Chinese past is that the term historical nihilism has turned up again. Being accused of being a historical nihilist is basically that you're criticizing or you're challenging the CCP's monopoly on the past. Now you have a sense of what happens if Tencent is making a game that uses characters from the Chinese past. On the one hand, you're encouraged to be proud of the Chinese past. On the other side, you have to be a little careful what version of the past you are presenting. So this is about based on a paper I published with Paul Martin in 2020. So Honor of Kings were for some time the most downloaded game ever. It comes from Tencent, Tencent is a huge company. Today, the stock value of Tencent is about 1/8 of Apple, but Tencent's stock value has been much higher. It's a MOBA. You join a team of 4 other players by first picking a character from a roster of historical characters that all Chinese players will recognize. So it makes sense for a corporation to tap into the past by offering these recognizable characters. And then as part of your team, you are trying to beat another team of 5 characters. Now, as you can tell from this rendition of the characters on the screen, the versions of these historical and legendary characters is very popular. It's not a particular respectful way of presenting these past characters from the Chinese past. There are examples of gender swapping. A man becomes a woman. A well-known poet becomes an assassin. These are a couple of examples that are then being criticized later. Now, so if you use characters to the Chinese past, you are sort of ticking a couple of boxes here. You're proud of Chinese culture, but it has to be done in a way that has respect for authorized versions of the past. So this is where Paul and I got interested, because the party expresses its disapproval through two mouthpieces, newspapers, the People's Daily and Guangming Daily, that severely criticize Tencent for what they have done to the Chinese past. Incidentally, they're also criticizing that this leads to addiction. So addiction, you can't really talk about games in China without talking about addiction as well, but we're just leaving that aside for now. What I'm interested in is the misrepresentation, as it were, of the Chinese past that is part of the criticism. So the day after the People's Daily makes this very severe criticism, Tencent decides to limit players' access to their product. Ultimately, they make various changes to the game, and they lose $15.1 billion of their stock value. So 5% of the Tencent's value disappears. Now, this is interesting, I think, in itself, but we are particularly interested, me and Paul, because people had already expressed concerns about the representation of the Chinese past. This is something that happens in July of 17. But here's a screenshot from the article Paul and I did. We are basing that article on qualitative content analysis of social media material that we harvest from Jihu, sort of a questions and answers platform in China. And so these questions and all the answers here are read by many people. And the first question that we are interested in comes in a year before, right, in the summer of 16. Does Honor of Kings disrespect history, right? And people start getting involved in that debate. Later, some of the questions we look at then have to do with the party state's attempt at inserting itself in an ongoing public debate about Tencent's use of history. So it sort of starts as a relationship between the people, the public, and the corporation. And the state comes a little later and tries to get into this debate. What to make of the People's Daily microblog reposting of Guangming Daily's article about Honor of Kings, for example. So that comes several months after this is happening. I'll go through this really quickly and just get to our qualitative content analysis had a number of coding categories. I'll just highlight a couple of them. And we were talking about 4chan being sort of the opposite of wise or something, but because we were really impressed by the level, the sophistication of public debate in Chinese social media. We had people discussing who is the rightful custodian of the Chinese past. Is it parents? Is it schools? In other words, the state? Is it perhaps to some extent Tencent? So this is something that we found in our material. And that brings me to this idea of looking at this through a tripartite analytical scheme, where you have state, corporation, and people. We needed that in there. We are talking about popular heritage, which we define as a set of user-centered and intertextual interpretative strategies that says popular heritage apart from authorized heritage. That's how we define popular heritage. And we needed to define popular heritage in that way, partly to get away from a binary understanding of people and elite, people or power block. Popular heritage is activated in hegemonic situations. So hegemony from Gramsci to Stuart Hall, and then to John Fiske in cultural studies, we think about hegemony as something that has hegemonic situations where the so-called power block, as Stuart Hall puts it, presents the status quo as something that you, the people, must agree to. And you do that as part of your consumption of popular products, right? So what we found fascinating in our case here was that power block, it's quite uncontroversial to say, oh, the state and the corporations, they are sort of part of the status quo. They are trying to get the people to agree to this status quo setup. But we are noting a fissure in that power block. And that's where we suggest a tripartite state corporation people scheme. Now, 2017, that was the date of this sort of long event that we are looking at, and that brings us to suggest this tripartite scheme. And looking back on that now, I think that fissure is closing. Paul and I were already in our conclusion being a little pessimistic about the direction of Chinese popular culture. So just to return to my simplification of the CCP control of future, present, and past. Since these 17 events, we have seen various crackdowns where the party is insisting on leading in all aspects of life, including private education. We saw a number of crackdowns in the summer of 2020. And very importantly for those of us who are interested in games, a crackdown on big tech. That crackdown was really a question of people's data, personal data. It was as if big tech thought that this personal data belongs to us, and the state came and say, people's private data does not belong to the corporation, it belongs to the state. Very different from a European understanding of ownership of data, incidentally. In 21, we saw a freeze on permissions to publish new video games, a complete freeze. So no new games could legally be published. That was gradually lifted from June 2022. As for the past, Gru and Liu have done work on how Tencent specifically have responded to party state probings or attempts at directing them. And they're concluding that looking at 2011 to 2019, Tencent has effectively adhered to the country's, the party's calls of rejuvenating traditional Chinese culture. So I would say that Tencent is increasingly in line with what the party state would like to see. And long story short, I mean, that power block fissure is essentially, has been closing, especially rapidly since 2020. Right. I'd like to talk a little bit about cinematic video game adaptation here towards the end of my talk, because another thing that happened over the last few years has to do with this insistence on being present in all parts of online culture. I'm talking about an adaptation of a video game. I've signed a contract with the Edinburgh University Press for a book called Cinematic Video Game Adaptation and Eco-Queer Perspective. So this will include a case study of a Chinese video game, Onmoji, being adapted into the film The Yin Yang Master, which is another example of using the Chinese past. So just to explain extremely briefly what I'm trying to do here, I mean, an eco-queer perspective, we have two concepts here. We have queerness and we have ecology. I follow Camp Barrett in loosely defining queer as a radical questioning of identity and binaries, including the nature-culture binary. And ecology, I understand roughly as an intellectual underpinning of climate activism. So the book is looking at what happens to these two intertwined themes when a video game becomes a film. There's been some talk in adaptation studies about adaptation as a type of queering. But when I'm looking at my corpus of adaptations of video games, I also see straightening. So we can talk about eco-queering, combining and adding or highlighting of these two interconnected themes with this case study, a Chinese game being, thank you, adapted into a Chinese film. So I mentioned crackdowns of various kinds before, and there is a link here to game making and big tech. So from 2018, there have been various attacks, sort of mirroring what I mentioned before, how the party can express its discontent with stuff through various mouthpieces. Xinhua would be another example. And Xinhua has, since 2018, been attacking what is referred to as little fresh meat in China. It's basically sort of handsome young men, and they're being attacked for being Yang Pao, which it basically means sissy. It's a very vulgar and negative term to use. The funny thing, not funny, but the extraordinary thing is that that term, Ning Piao, has now been used since 2021 in official pronouncements. So celebrities, online celebrities are being, who are objectively speaking, handsome young men, but they are too effeminate. They are being attacked for being sissy, for being Yang Pao. You wouldn't hear the president use that word, but he will be talking about protecting the traditional family and that kind of thing. The extraordinary thing is that Yang Pao is now used in some official pronouncements. So that there has been news stories circling around about a ban on effeminate men in this connection with this. And that ban on Yang Piao has been linked to this crackdown on big tech, including Tencent, including game making. So it's interesting that these attempts at regulating how young men present themselves in China, they come at the same time as my case study of the Yin Yang Master. I'm picking that game adaptation out because you have again a use of the Chinese past, so traditional yin yang understandings of ecological balance. So the ecology part is there, and you can also start talking about queerness when you look at the ambivalent masculinities of the villains and the protagonists of the game. These are screenshots from the game itself, and they have this sort of Bishonen aesthetic going on, that there's a real appreciation of the beauty of slightly effeminate boys and young men. So we can perhaps talk about straightening of Onyoji into the film The Yin Yang Master. just by referring to the deletion of these that Bishonen aesthetics. But things are a bit more complicated than that. In the film, queerness is associated with evil and excess, at least in the villain, as I'm trying to illustrate with these shots from the film. But the protagonist also has a sort of an ambivalent masculinity going on. He is a hybrid of human and monster. In certain situation, you can hardly see it, but he's not a particular sort of manly man in the film itself. When he's interacting with tough soldiers, for example, his way of fluttering around and using a fan sort of signifies a masculinity that is relatively less hegemonic than that of others. The protagonist is also finding peace and also allies in various liminal spaces in nature, drugs, and also liminal spaces in cities, a brothel, for example. So this close reading of the adaptation sits well with ongoing work that develops this idea of queer ecology, so that the liminal spaces where you will find that association of queerness, liminal spaces. So that's a slightly more hopeful way of ending the presentation. Thank you. And I'm also looking forward to Fallout. So yeah.